They called him the original American gangster. Before Pablo Escobar, before El Chapo, there was Frank Lucas, a man who rose from the dirt roads of North Carolina to control Harlem's heroin empire, building a dynasty so massive it shook America's underworld to its core. Frank Lucas's beginnings were nothing like his empire. Born in 1930 in LaGrange, North Carolina, he grew up with nothing. His mother stretched coins, his father took any work he could find, and dinner some nights was cornbread and water. He wore shoes until the soles were skin. But it wasn't just poverty pressing on his chest, it was fear. In the Jim Crow South, a glance could get you killed. When Frank was 6, he watched a cousin, barely a teen, dragged off and murdered by a Klan mob for something as thin as a rumor. He remembered the orange of flames against night sky and learned a lesson he never forgot. In America, power isn't offered, it's taken. By 13, he was hustling out of hunger, not ambition, stealing chickens, robbing freight off slow trains, fixing dice. He learned how to watch a room and hear what wasn't said. He learned when to smile and when to vanish. After a fight that nearly left a man dead, Frank looked at the map in his head, picked the only road that made sense, and ran north. He'd heard the word Harlem the way some people hear heaven. Harlem in the late 1940s didn't feel like a neighborhood. It felt like a current. Jazz bled through walls, preachers shouted on corners, card games flipped fortunes on kitchen tables. People were broke and beautiful at the same time. Suits pressed, shoes shined, rent late. Frank stepped into that river and let it carry him until he found the man who could teach him the tide. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a strategist in a silk tie. He knew when to shake a hand and when to break it. Frank attached himself like a shadow. He drove, he fetched, he listened. Bumpy's rules weren't written, they were lived. Never lie to yourself. Don't flash what you can't defend. And the loudest man in the room? Weakest every time. Frank memorized the creed. If Harlem was a chessboard, Bumpy knew all the openings. He taught Frank how to bribe a cop once and never twice, how to keep the peace so cops could report quiet and politicians could praise stability. He taught him to move like fog, present everywhere, seen nowhere. Frank learned that power wasn't just violence, it was order. When Bumpy died in 1968, a heart attack in a restaurant, fork falling, the whole room holding its breath, men in other zip codes licked their lips. The Italian mob had long treated Harlem like a rental they forgot to return, skimming off the top of everything from numbers to narcotics. With Bumpy gone, they expected a surrender. Frank wrote a different script. He went to Southeast Asia. Not through middlemen, not through favors, but personally. The Golden Triangle was a rumor to most dealers, a place in an atlas where purity could be purchased like lumber. Frank stepped into that heat and negotiated face-to-face with suppliers whose product didn't need cutting to make you see God. He wasn't trying to buy a few bricks. He was building a pipeline. How do you move heroin into the most watched country on earth? You hide it where watching looks like disrespect. U.S. military coffins. Beneath bodies wrapped for burial, kilos rode home under a blanket of sanctity that no customs officer wanted to question. It was monstrous, brilliant, and, for a time, unstoppable. While grief consoled families on porches, invisible freight slid from tarmac to Vanda City. What trickled onto Harlem's corners came with a name, Blue Magic. Frank understood branding before the marketers did. He wanted every fiend, dealer, and halfway hustler to know what his bag meant. No shake, no soap, no lies. Pure hit. He packaged consistency the way legit companies package cereal. The same every time so the customer never wandered. Within a year, the air changed. People leaned in when whispers said blue. Rival crews stopped shooting on certain corners out of survival. You can't sell if everyone's ducking bullets. Frank built a distribution machine like a family tree. Blood relatives ran stash apartments. Cousins counted cash. In-laws drove cars that never got stopped. Loyalty didn't need a contract if Thanksgiving turned into payroll. He didn't call it a cartel. He called it work. Pay the man who shows up. Fire the man who steals. Move lower product out of the neighborhood. Keep the good stuff where rumor becomes demand. He paid soldiers to stand near schoolyards not to sell, but to keep other sellers away. Not out of conscience, out of brand protection. Blue Magic couldn't be seen near kids. He wasn't building chaos. He was building faith. Money didn't so much roll in as arrive. In stacks, in duffels, in false bottom trunks. $1 million a day wasn't a boast. It was a logistics problem. Where do you put it? Some in a closet wall, some in a church basement, some handed to men with badges because peace has rent too. Frank bought a mansion in New Jersey that looked like a senator owned it. Fountains, marble, a backyard zoo, because what else do you buy when the numbers feel fake? He wore suits that could quiet a room and a chinchilla coat that could wake one up. That coat shouldn't matter in the calculus of crime, but it did. Harlem noticed. Reporters noticed. So did the wrong people. Detectives who'd been building cases without faces finally had a face that didn't fit the seats he sat in. "Who is he?" asked a man who'd been watching mob bosses for 20 years. "And why is he closer to the ring than they are?" The Italian mob reacted like a blue blood family discovering an uninvited guest at the head of their table. For decades, they had been the toll booth on heroin. Frank found the service road. Suddenly, men with names ending in vowels began asking whether an example should be made. There were approaches in parking lots, offers of partnership that were really leashes, and threats spoken softly, the way a doctor softens bad news. Frank didn't fold. He had two arguments the mob understood: profits and police. If a war started, the heat would torch everybody and the money would curdle. If peace held, the river flowed. He also carried a quieter weapon: relationships with cops who liked their Christmas envelopes heavy and their crime stats low. An Italian once said to him, "You don't know who you're fighting." Frank replied, calm as rain, "You don't know who I'm paying." But money doesn't stop everything. It can't stop addiction. It can't stop anger. It can't keep a secret forever. Blue magic didn't just make Frank rich, it collapsed people. A grandmother watched her boy shrink to bone under an army jacket. A barber swept the same man's hair for years until one day he swept up nothing because the man stopped coming, replaced by someone with vacant eyes and a nodding neck. Churches started meal lines. Ambulances learned certain corners like cab drivers learned landmarks. Frank called it business. The neighborhood called it a plague dressed in a nice suit. Respect moved in two directions at once: fear for the man who could buy the block, resentment for the product that was selling the block's soul. Harlem has always been able to hold two truths in one hand. They loved Frank, and they hated what he brought. He had rivals who smelled weakness under the perfume. Men like Nicky Barnes, Mr. Untouchable, who wore swagger like a uniform and taunted the system with headlines. Nicky loved cameras. Frank loved angles. On good days, they negotiated streets like diplomats divide seas. On bad days, there were funerals and mothers who refused to cry on camera. Across the river, a detective named Richie Roberts built a reputation for one thing that made him weird in his line of work: honesty. In a city where many pockets rattled, Roberts kept his empty. He studied Frank the way a hunter studies wind. He didn't want headlines. He wanted evidence that sang in court: wiretaps, surveillance logs, bankers with nervous hands. He learned the rhythm of Frank's life: Sundays with family, Mondays with money, Fridays with inventory. Frank felt the breath on his neck and tightened. He stopped wearing the coat. He traveled with fewer men and heavier silence. He changed cars the way other people changed topics. He played chess with the idea that the board extended past the table and into the walls. Christmas morning, 1975. Federal agents moved on Frank's mansion like a shadow hardening. Doors buckled, drawers emptied, closets surrendered their secrets. They found cash sleeping in shoeboxes like eggs in straw. They found ledgers written in a hand that thought it was invisible. They found the distance between a whisper and a sentence. Frank Lucas was arrested. Cameras clicked like insects. A reporter yelled a question that didn't deserve an answer. A kid on a bicycle watched from the sidewalk and learned that morning that kings also kneel. A judge read numbers that sounded like years: 70. Some men snap when they hear it. Frank did arithmetic. He measured the value of what he knew against the weight of what he'd lose. He made a choice that would redraw maps. He cooperated. Names came out one by one: dirty cops who liked the taste of envelopes, federal agents who liked the feel of power, rivals who smiled too easily. The city shook. 100 law enforcement careers ended, some in cuffs, some in shame. The same machine that had looked the other way to keep the street orderly discovered that rot looks like stability until you scrape it. People called Frank a rat. Others called it reckoning. Frank called it math. Prison took what money can't buy back: time. Frank outlived his empire and then outlasted his sentence. Paroled after cooperation, shaved decades off. He walked into a city rearranged by crack, by new crews, by new acronyms. The old alleys didn't echo his name anymore. The young ones looked at him like a museum piece. Interesting, not instructive. He stumbled, reoffended, returned to cells, then came out again older, slower, carrying a history that no one really wants until Hollywood asks for it. In 2007, American Gangster told his story the way movies do, with cleaner edges and brighter lights. People argued about the details the way they always do. What was myth? What was method? Which parts were true enough to feel true? Frank did interviews from a wheelchair in later years, sometimes contrite, sometimes proud, never flat. He liked telling the part where he beat the mob. He liked less telling the part where whole blocks been under his product. The neighborhood that made him kept moving. Sidewalk memorials came and went for boys whose names never hit newspapers. Grandmothers outlived grandsons. Storefront churches opened where clubs used to throb. The past lives next to the present in Harlem. They nod to each other every morning. Ask old heads on 116th Street, and they'll tell you two things at once. Frank was a king, and Frank was a curse. There's a version of the story that makes him a mastermind. The man who outsmarted the mafia, who built a brand, who ran a syndicate like an MBA case study. There's another version that makes him a villain. The man who sold poison, who exploited grief, who watched neighborhoods collapse and kept counting. The truest version holds both. He was steel and smoke, discipline and damage. Blue magic funded funerals and fur coats. It bought loyalty and broke families. It taught a grim lesson about American capitalism, brand, supply, efficiency, market share. The language of boardrooms applied to alleys. Frank proved that if you run a criminal enterprise like a company, it can act like one. Expand faster, crush competition, move silently, then collapse under its own growth and greed. The coffin pipeline remains the part that makes people sit forward. Was every shipment under a body? Were some hidden in false bottom furniture, in military cargo crates, in ways that will never be written down? Ask 10 men who were there, and you'll get 10 answers, each with a reason to lie or memory bent by time. What's certain is that heroin rode home from war on routes meant for heroes. And that irony is why his story refuses to fade. There's a human economy under every headline. A mortician paid extra to look away. A soldier paid rent. A cop bought a boat. A landlord replaced a tenant who nodded off one too many times in the hallway. Frank sits at the center of that web, not as the only spider, but as the one who spun the pattern tightest for a moment in time. He loved control. He demanded his dealers wear clean shoes and speak with respect. He banned street corner chaos near his best customers. He punished theft with the cold math of replacement. He hosted Sunday dinners where grace was said over money that would never fit on a table. He told himself, and sometimes reporters, that he wasn't like other dealers because he kept order. The neighborhood's counter-argument stands in old photographs of hollow cheeks and vacant eyes. The turn, the flipping, gave his enemies an easy word: rat. It also offered a harsh mirror to a city that tolerated predators in uniform as long as the streets looked tidy by end of shift. You can hate the man and still admit the system needed breaking. Two truths, one city. Frank Lucas died in 2019 at 88, long enough to see himself cast in bronze and in blame. Long enough to watch kids argue on barbershop couches about whether he was a legend or a lesson. Long enough to see Harlem survive him, which might be the only measure that matters. People will always ask, how did he do it? The real question is, why was it possible? Because grief creates blind spots. Because money buys silence. Because America loves a brand, even when the product kills you. Because a man who learns early that the world won't feed him will teach himself to hunt. And sometimes he'll hunt his own. They called him the original American gangster. A boy who stared at burning crosses and decided never to be powerless again. A student who learned from a mentor that whispers are stronger than shouts. A kingpin who cut out the middleman and sold a brand like a Fortune 500. A husband who wore mink to a fight and accidentally invited the law into the ring. A witness who traded names for time. A man whose empire taught a city that order built on damage is still damage. In the world he ruled, power arrives quickly and leaves all at once. It buys a coat that warms no one and a house full of rooms you can't sleep in. It feeds a beast that never says thank you. Frank Lucas built his throne on concrete and lightning, and like every kingdom that mistakes fear for forever, it fell, loudly, publicly, and exactly on schedule.